been the 80th anniversary of the Nuremberg race laws and the 70th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials. This important anniversary gives expression to the values of the conference here today, reflecting on both the unique particularities and the universal lessons of genocide and the Holocaust, and moving towards justice and accountability. So as Professor Kotler has said before, may today not only be an act of remembrance, but a remembrance to always act. Indeed, Professor Kotler embodies these ideals. He is a professor emeritus at McGill University Faculty of Law, former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and an internationally acclaimed human rights lawyer. He has represented leading dissidents, including Nelson Mandela and Andrei Sakharov, and currently serves as international legal counsel to imprisoned Saudi blogger Raif Badawi, whose wife Ensaf will be speaking tomorrow at the conference here, as well as representing, Professor Carlos represents Venezuelan Democratic Opposition leader Leopoldo Lopez. And with respect to today's subject matter, genocide and accountability, we are actually approaching April, which in a private member's bill in Parliament, which was spearheaded by Professor Kotler, April was recognized as Genocide Awareness and Prevention Month. So it's particularly timely once again. And as minister, Professor Kotler headed the Canadian delegation to the Stockholm Conference on the Prevention and Combating of Genocide, and made the pursuit of international justice a top priority for the Canadian government. This included the first initiatives and first ever prosecutions for incitement to genocide and the commission of mass atrocity and genocide in Rwanda, and war criminals who are here, including the famous Mugesera case, which I highly advise all of you to read, which is in and of itself a case study for providing a framework in combating genocide and incitement to genocide. But I will leave Professor Kotler to provide his inspired remarks on the subject of pursuing Holocaust, genocide, and human rights, pursuing justice and accountability. We're lucky to have him with us here today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kotler to podium.
Thank you, Brandon, for those kind remarks, but in particular your substantive remarks with regard to the theme of the conference, and indeed the theme of my own remarks on the Holocaust, genocide, and human rights. And I want to pay special tribute to you for your dedicated organizational involvement with respect to this conference, along with Marlene Grossman and those in Vanier who have put, as you have so aptly stated, this historic conference together. And so I'm delighted to be able to be here and to participate in the common cause which brings us together, which is the struggle against racism, against hate, against anti-Semitism, against mass atrocity, against the crime whose name we should even shudder to mention, namely genocide. And always, as Elie Wiesel would remind us, and always against indifference. And as the panel that just preceded us taught us, all this is part of the larger struggle for the pursuit of justice, for peace, for human rights, and human dignity in our time. Indeed, as it happens, we meet at an important, almost historic moment of remembrance and reminder of bearing witness and taking action. We meet, as Brandon has said, in the immediate aftermath of the 80th anniversary of the Nuremberg race laws, a state-sanctioned incitement to hate and to genocide, indeed, which became prologue and precursor to the Holocaust. We meet also in the aftermath of the 72nd anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, death camp Auschwitz, the most brutal extermination camp of the 20th century, reminding us of horrors too terrible to be believed but not too terrible to have happened. And we are fortunate that following my remarks, we will be able to have the personal witness testimony of Sidney Zoltak, not only a Holocaust survivor, but one whose moral courage and compelling testimony is singular in its authenticity and in its impact. We meet also on the eve of Genocide Prevention Month, which the House of Commons some 2 years ago set aside for a month of awareness and prevention and combating of genocide. And in it, the House of Commons recognized 5 genocides, which are also the 5 genocides recognized in the Canadian Museum of Human Rights. The first, and as we can mention it today, the first genocide of the 20th century, the Armenian Genocide. Recalling, and important to recall, the mocking words of Hitler when he set upon for his own genocide, who today remembers the Armenians, as he put it? Well, we remember, we recognize, and we will act. The second, and Roman gave expression to this, was the genocide of the Ukrainians. And he appropriately invoked Raoul Lemkin and his characterization of the four-pronged character of the genocide of the Ukrainians. The third was the Holocaust, and I'm doing this in the chronology in which these 5 genocides took place and indeed were acknowledged in the parliamentary motion. The third was the Holocaust, of which Elie Wiesel, the moral compass of our time, who passed away last July, but indeed who underpins almost everything that I will say, as he was not only my colleague and friend, but my mentor in all these matters, who said of the Holocaust that the Holocaust was a war against the Jews, in which not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were victims. The fourth was the mass murder that took place, the mass murder of Muslims in Srebrenica. And the fifth was the genocide of the Tutsis in Rwanda. And here Moses was appropriately reminding us that we must speak in terms of the understanding that the targeted group was a genocide of the Tutsis in Rwanda. And you know, we are about to commemorate the 24th anniversary of the 23rd anniversary of this genocide. It's astonishing to recall that 10,000 Tutsis were murdered every day, for 3 months, from April to the end of June 1994, while the world stood by, not only as a bystander, but effectively as an enabler. And as I mentioned, these 5 genocides recognized in Genocide Prevention Month, we should also appreciate that it does not recognize 2 genocides, for example, of the 21st century. I'm referring to that of Darfur and to that of the Yazidis, which took a while to itself be acknowledged as a genocide, let alone some of the 20th century, which were not themselves acknowledged with regard to the Roma, and I might add, as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada referred and characterized, the cultural genocide of our Indigenous people, of whom we will hear more tomorrow in the talk by Senator Murray Sinclair, who headed up our Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so on this important moment of remembrance and reminder, which prospectively also includes us being on the eve of the 70th anniversary of both the Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we must ask ourselves, what have we learned? What are the lessons? And secondly, and no less important, what must we do? What is the action that it requires of us in the light of these lessons? And so let me share with you some of the universal lessons of these genocides, using the Holocaust as a paradigm of evil in our time, as a paradigm also with respect to these lessons. While I'm referring to the singularity of the Holocaust, I will be embracing the universality of the lessons as set forth in the previous panel and as epitomized in the Holocaust. The first is the danger of forgetting, the imperative of remembrance. As the French put it, le devoir de mémoire, of remembrance of victims defamed, demonized, dehumanized, as prologue and indeed justification for their mass murder. Where the mass murder of 6 million Jews and millions of non-Jews in the Holocaust must not, and those millions murdered in the other genocides, must not simply be seen in terms of abstract statistics. As we say on moments of remembrance, and appropriately enough on the eve of Genocide Prevention Month, that unto each person there is a name. Each person has an identity. Each person is a universe. As our sages teach us, if you save a single life, it is as if you have saved an entire universe. Just as if you kill a single person, it is as if you have murdered an entire universe. And so the abiding lesson which emerges, the first of these lessons in terms of action, that we must each see ourselves wherever we are as the guarantors of each other's destiny. And as the Czech novelist Milan Kundera put it in larger terms, that the struggle of memory against forgetting is a struggle of freedom against tyranny. The second lesson is the danger of state-sanctioned incitement to genocide, the responsibility to prevent. The Holocaust and the other genocides, and particularly that which followed in Rwanda, occurred not only because of the machinery of death, but because of state-sanctioned incitement to hate and to genocide. It was this teaching of contempt, this demonizing of the other, this is where it all begins. As the Supreme Court of Canada itself put it, the Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers. It began with words. And in terms of the important principle and precedent in the Muga Serra case, which Brandon mentioned, an important precedent internationally, as the court put it, the very incitement to hate and genocide constitutes the crime in and of itself, whether or not acts of genocide follow. And it is sometimes forgotten that the first incitement to genocide in the 21st century occurred on January 3rd, 2000, where Ayatollah Khamenei of Iran, and I want to distinguish from the people and publics of Iran, who are otherwise themselves the targets of mass oppression, where he began the 21st century by saying there can be no resolution to the Arab-Israeli conflict without the annihilation of the Jewish state, not even using the euphemism of the Zionist entity, without the annihilation of the Jewish state. And here too, the indifference and inaction was deafening. Which leads me now to the third lesson, a lesson most eloquently taught us by Elie Wiesel, and that is the danger of silence in the face of evil, and the imperative of standing up always against injustice. As Elie Wiesel put it in his 1986 Nobel Prize lecture, and I'm quoting, "We must always take sides in the face of evil. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Wherever men or women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe. And he added, and with these words, I close his quote, "There may be times when we are powerless to prevent injustice," but the crucial words, "but there must never be a time when we fail to protest against injustice." And so the action-oriented imperative that emerges from this lesson, that we always, in the face of evil, we always must stand up and be counted, and not look around to see whoever else may be standing, because in the world in which we live, there are few people prepared to take a stand, even less that are prepared to be counted. Which brings me now to the next lesson, the fourth lesson, and that is the danger of anti-Semitism, the responsibility to combat it, as Charles Small put it so compellingly in his opening lecture this morning, of anti-Semitism as the oldest and most enduring of hatreds, and tragically, the most lethal. If the Holocaust is a paradigm of radical evil, then anti-Semitism is a metaphor for radical hatred. From 1940 to the beginning of 1945, 1.3 million people were deported to the death camps in Auschwitz. 1.1 million of them were Jews. Let there be no doubt about it. Jews were murdered in Auschwitz because of anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism did not die in Auschwitz. It remains the bloodied canary in the mineshaft of global evil. And the responsibility to combat was set forth, and this is a parliamentary template for us, 2 years ago in Parliament in the House of Commons, which unanimously adopted a resolution, and I'm excerpting from it, which condemned first the alarming global rise in anti-Semitism. Second, called upon the Canadian government and Parliament and people to make the combating of anti-Semitism a priority both domestically and internationally. And then concluded by saying, extracting from the Ottawa Protocol to combat anti-Semitism, which grew out of an international parliamentary conference, which said that criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitic, and saying so is wrong. But singling Israel out for selective opprobrium and indictment, denying Israel's right to exist, let alone calling for its destruction, is hateful and discriminatory and anti-Semitic, and not saying so is dishonest. Which brings me now to the fifth lesson, which follows inexorably from the above, and that is the danger of Holocaust denial. I would also say genocide denial. We see it with respect to whether it be the first genocide of the 20th century, namely the Armenians, or the more recent genocide of Rwanda. The danger of denial, the responsibility to repudiate false witness. The Holocaust denial movement, the cutting edge of anti-Semitism, old and new, is not just an assault on Jewish memory and human dignity in its accusation that the Holocaust is a hoax. Rather, it constitutes an international criminal conspiracy to cover up the worst crimes in history. Indeed, it not only holds that the Holocaust was a hoax, but maligns the Jews for fabricating the hoax. And so our responsibility, whether it be Holocaust denial or genocide denial, in reference to the other genocides about which we heard in the previous panel, we have a responsibility to unmask the bearers of false witness, to expose the criminality of the deniers as we protect the dignity of their victims. Which leads me now to the sixth lesson, and that is the danger of indifference and inaction in the face of mass atrocity, the responsibility to act and protect. This painful and poignant lesson, simply put, is that the crimes of the Holocaust, crimes of other genocides, resulted not only from state-sanctioned incitement to hatred and genocide, but from crimes of indifference, from conspiracies of silence, from the international community not only as a bystander, but the international community as an enabler. As it happens, we meet on the eve of the 23rd anniversary of the Rwandan genocide, April 7th. I proposed a motion which happily was adopted in Parliament some 9 years ago, that April 7th should be set aside as a national day for a reflection on the prevention of genocide, with particular reference to the genocide of the Tutsis. Because what makes the genocide of the Tutsis so unspeakable, is not only the horror of the genocide itself. That would be bad enough. What makes it so unspeakable is that this genocide was preventable. Nobody can say that we did not know. We knew, but we did not act. Just as nobody can say with respect to Darfur, we did not know. We knew, but we did not act. Just as nobody can say with respect to Syria that we did not know. We knew, but we did not act. We've just commemorated the 6th anniversary of what began in March 2011 as a hopeful manifestation of the Arab Spring. And as someone who has spent myself a good deal of time in Syria in the 70s and the like, I felt that there was an incipient citizens movement here with respect to democratization in Syria. But what happened when these young people marched in March 2011 with olive branches saying, peace, peace, dignity, dignity, they were gunned down. Those who came to assist them were also gunned down. And then began the scorched earth policy of the Assad regime. Towards the end of 2011, and as I wrote in an article in November 2000, there were, quote unquote, only 4,000 dead at the time. I didn't say only then, but I'm speaking in retrospect, 4,000 dead. Those of us who called at the time for the international community to intervene, that this was a classic case for R2P, of which we heard earlier, of the responsibility to protect, which says that whenever you have a situation of war crimes and crimes against humanity, God forbid genocide being committed, and the country in which they are being committed, the government is unable or unwilling to do anything about it, or worse, as in the case of Assad's Syria, was the author of that criminality, then there's a responsibility on behalf of the international community to intervene and protect the innocent targeted civilians. Well, those of us who called for the invocation of R2P some 5 years ago were told, if you intervene, this will lead to sectarian warfare, this will lead to civil war, this will lead to jihadists coming in. Everything we were told would happen if we intervened happened because we didn't intervene. And whereas there were only some 4,000 dead by November 2011, the killings that began, as I said, in March 2011, and maybe some 10,000 displaced, we are speaking today, as we meet, of over 500,000 murdered, of close to 13 million Syrian civilians displaced, of whom more than 5 million are refugees in neighboring countries and elsewhere. And happily, Canada accepted some 25,000 refugees and will accept more. But what we must never ignore while we address the consequences of this genocide in Syria, we must never ignore and forget the causes. And the causes were the indifference and inaction by an international bystander and enabling community. Which leads me now to the seventh lesson, and that is the danger of cultures of impunity, of the responsibility to bring war criminals to justice. If the 20th century was the age of atrocity, and in the 21st century, beginning with Darfur and the like, continued to be the age of atrocity, culminating, of course, in Syria, let alone what was happening with the Yazidis as well. If this was the age of atrocity, it was also the age of impunity. Few of the perpetrators were brought to justice. Not one Syrian war criminal has yet been brought to justice, let alone those in other killing fields. But with regard to the mass murder in Syria, not one must be brought to justice. And again, let there be no mistake about it. If we do not bring these war criminals to justice, we are encouraging more war crimes. We are enabling more war criminals. We are encouraging a culture of impunity, which ends up being a culture of ongoing criminality and war crimes. And so it's our responsibility to unmask these cultures of impunity, to hold these war criminals accountable. And that is why one of the bills I tabled before I retired from Parliament was a global human rights accountability legislation to hold those responsible for gross violations of human rights accountable, at least with respect to the fact that we will not permit them to enter Canada or to launder their proceeds here, while we work as well internationally to bring them to justice and counter the impunity of the host countries who continue to commit these crimes. Which brings me to the next lesson, and I'll be moving now to a close, and that is, in terms of the eighth lesson here, what I would call la trahison des clercs, the betrayal of the elites, and the responsibility, therefore, to speak truth to power and to hold these elites to account. Simply put, the Holocaust was made possible not only because of the bureaucratization of genocide, as Robert Lifton put it, and as the Nazi desk murderer Adolf Eichmann himself personified, but because of the trahison des clercs, the complicity of the elites, including physicians, faith leaders, judges, lawyers, engineers, architects, educators, and the like. Holocaust crimes, therefore, were the crimes of the Nuremberg elites. And so it's our responsibility as citoyens du monde, as citizens of the world, to always speak truth to power and to hold power accountable to truth. The double entendre of Nuremberg, the Nuremberg of hate and the Nuremberg of judgments, must be part of our learning as it is part of our legacy. The ninth lesson, the danger of assaults on the vulnerable and the powerless. Indeed, the vulnerability of the powerless and the powerlessness of the vulnerable was dramatized so painfully for me during my visits to Auschwitz, to the death camp in Auschwitz, where one would see there the remnants of shoes and suitcases, of crutches and hair of the murdered and defamed innocent. Indeed, it is as revealing as Professor Henry Friedlander points out in his work titled The Origins of Nazi Genocide, that the first group targeted for killing were the Jewish disabled. And so it's our responsibility always to give voice to the voiceless as we seek to empower the powerless, be they the disabled, the poor, the elderly, violated women, victimized by violence, or vulnerable children, the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. Leads me to the 10th lesson, that the Holocaust and the other genocides included horrific crimes against women. Moreover, these crimes against women not only attended the genocide of which it is sometimes spoken, but more importantly, they were in pursuit of that genocide rather than just being consequences of the genocide. Yet they remain the still unarticulated horror of the genocide of European Jewry. And some 70 years later, that lesson remains not only to be learned, but to acted upon, to be acted upon. Whether we speak of the horrific crimes committed against the Yazidi women, or the crimes against women in the Congo, or in Syria, or Boko Haram, and the like. And we must always appreciate, when we speak in terms of violence against women, that significant numbers of the world's population are routinely subject to rape, assault, torture, starvation, humiliation, mutilation, and even murder simply because they are women. Which leads to the 11th lesson, and that is the danger of mass atrocities against children, the responsibility to prevent and protect. If there is an atrocity that belies understanding, it is the willful exploitation, maiming, and killing of a child, the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. It is sometimes forgotten that the Nazi genocide was a genocide of millions of children. At 1.5 million children perished in the Holocaust of European Jewry. But we have yet to learn from the lessons of these mass murders and assaults on children in the various genocides as well, let alone to act upon it. As we meet, millions of children the world over are being subjected to arbitrary detention, torture, slavery, cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment, and recruitment as child soldiers incited to terrorize and kill others. And so I say that the most important human rights lesson that I was ever taught was taught to me by my daughter when she was 15. She's now 37 years of age. When she said to me at the time, she said, "Daddy, if you want to know what the real test of human rights is, then always ask yourself, at any time, in any situation, in any part of the world, is it good for children? Is what is happening good for children?" And so our responsibility to prevent and protect against assaults on children must be that which underpins everything we do in all our human rights work. Lesson 12, the dangers of the bystander community, the responsibility to remember and pay tribute to the righteous among the nations. For these righteous among the nations, of whom Raoul Wallenberg is metaphor and message, deserve not only always to be remembered, but where we must always be inspired by those who had the compassion to care and the courage to act, who confronted evil and thereby were able to transform history. Let me give you the poignant example of Raoul Wallenberg. And we named our Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights after our first honorary citizen, first Canadian honorary citizen, Raoul Wallenberg. Because it may not be known and sufficiently appreciated that from May to July 1944, in some 10 weeks, 440,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to the death camps in Auschwitz. Raoul Wallenberg arrived as a diplomat in the Swedish legation sent by the U.S. War Refugee Board in mid-July 1944. From the time he arrived, and through his good deeds in mobilizing others to work with him, in that regard, setting up safe houses, distributing protective diplomatic passes, and the like. Raoul Wallenberg and his associates saved the remnant of 100,000 Jews in 6 months, whereas the Nazis and their collaborators deported 440,000 Hungarian Jews to the death camps in 10 weeks, with the international community as bystander and enabler. And that's why we need to remember the righteous among the nations, of whom, as I said, Raoul Wallenberg was metaphor and message, and that is why the United Nations referred to him as the greatest humanitarian of the 20th century. And finally, I conclude, and leading into the next talk by Sidney Zoltag, about the legacy of Holocaust survivors. As my own visits to Auschwitz affirmed again and again, we must remember and indeed celebrate the survivors of the Holocaust, the true heroes of humanity, as we also must remember and celebrate the survivors of the other genocides of whom we heard so much so compellingly. For they witnessed and endured the worst of inhumanity. But somehow they found in the depths of their own humanity the courage to go on, to rebuild their lives as they rebuilt the communities in which they found themselves, including Canada. And so together with them, and these are my closing words, and they preface the Never Again declaration with which we will be closing the conference tomorrow. But with them, we must remember and pledge that never again will we be indifferent to incitement and hate. That never again will we be silent in the face of evil. That never again will we indulge racism and anti-Semitism and bigotry of any kind. That never again will we ignore the plight of the vulnerable. That never again will we be indifferent in the face of mass atrocity and the impunity which accompanies it. That we will speak up, and no less, if not more importantly, we will act against racism, against hate, against anti-Semitism, against anti-Muslim bigotry, against mass atrocity, against injustice, and against the crime, who, as I said when I began, the crime whose name we should even shudder to mention, but which we have had to so painfully experience, namely genocide. You'll hear from our survivor, Sidney Zoltag, the authenticity of that understanding and the need for us to act. Thank you.